Inspire Podcast, where mental health meets real life. I'm your host, Samantha Ariza, therapist, educator, semi-normal human being. Really always depends on who you ask. But I want to be your go-to person for real, relatable conversations about healing, growth, and this thing we call mental health and emotional wellness. Around here, we believe that mental health does not have to be stiff or scary or something taboo that we don't talk about. We keep it human, practical, and we have some fun along the way. Why not? Life's too serious as it is. Because not only is it serious, it is messy, and we're all just trying to figure it out. But I want to make it clear that this is not a replacement for therapy. It's just a way to get some extra help along the way, get more information, and just learn new things. Because each week, I'll give you some honest insights on what's going on, some science-backed tools, and we'll tell some stories. These stories are just to remind you that you're not alone. Whether you're on your own healing mental health journey or supporting someone else along the way, there's something here for you. So let's dive in. And today we're going to talk about an R word. Actually, two R words. And no, not racism. I don't think in this month of January I have the capacity to talk about racism in this world right now. But we are going to talk about a different one, resentment. Resentment is a very particular feeling. If you've ever dealt with it, you know what I'm talking about. Because it's not loud like anger. It's not heavy like grief. It's kind of this persistent kind of feeling that's playing underneath the surface. And it's replaying, remembering, and it gives you that sense that something's wrong and not right, and that it's almost a stuck feeling too. And if you've struggled with resentment, you might resonate with some of these feelings and statements. Like, I should be over this. It wasn't that bad. Other people move on from this. However, when we talk about resentment doesn't stick around just because you're being petty. And hey, people do it for the plot all the time. But it sticks around because your brain believes that something important is still unresolved. So today, we are talking about the science of resentment and its little brother, rumination, and why these things pair so tightly together and what your nervous system is actually doing along the way. And of course, my favorite part about tools to help you with it. So the things to keep in mind for today, the topics we are covering is resentment is not just anger. Number 2, why resentment doesn't fade. 3, the link between resentment and rumination. Number 4, the brain science behind it all. Why forgive and forget backfires. Number 6, and we're going to talk about suppression, which when we talk about emotions is a big one. I know I've mentioned it before, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the mechanics of suppression today and how that can play a part in resentment becoming chronic. But our last part, number 7, is going to be our practical tools, which I love. So let's get into it. Because resentment is not just anger. Resentment gets confused a lot when we talk about the emotions. It's often misunderstood as like we're holding a grudge or, we're becoming bitter people, but psychologically, it's much more specific than that. Resentment tends to form when these 3 things happen together, okay? 1, when a perceived injustice or boundary violation happens. 2, when there is limited power or an inability to respond at that time. And 3, there is a lack of acknowledgement, repair, or resolution, which means that something mattered, something hurt, and you didn't get to respond in a way that restored your dignity, safety, or even fairness. There are so many different examples of situations that can lead to resentment. In relationships, resentment is a big thing. And I know when we talk about like the Gottmans and couples therapy, if there are traces of resentment in a relationship, these things could be hard to overcome. Resentment can build, especially when we talk about infidelity in relationships, but even minor transgressions can lead to resentment in relationships. If a partner feels like there is unfairness in the responsibilities in the house, that can lead to resentment in that relationship. And even when we talk about resentment, there could be huge events or things that have happened to you that have felt unfair. We can talk about different traumatic events as well. I know in my family, my father in law, he was murdered. And that is something that we have to deal with. And there was a lot of resentment that grew because of this event for a very long time. Because resentment is often anger plus hurt and helplessness. And that helplessness piece is the critical piece. Because research on anger and injustice shows that anger normally motivates action. It's that big one that pushes us to do something, whether it's boundary setting, confrontation, or change. Anger doesn't let us sit still, we move. But when action isn't possible or even safe, anger doesn't get to complete its cycle. Instead, it turns inward and it becomes resentment. And you'll see when we talk about this more that resentment is kind of this stopped cycle of emotion. So, resentment, even though it's misconstrued as being too much anger, it's about this anger that really has nowhere to go. So, why doesn't this resentment fade on its own? Many emotions naturally resolved with time. Like as corny as it sounds, and even though it's not completely true, time does heal wounds over, sometimes. But resentment doesn't follow this pattern because resentment is not just an emotion. It's this big meaning making process. Your brain is just constantly asking, was I wronged? Was this fair? Did it matter? Did I matter? And should I have done something differently in this situation? As well as, how do I make sure this never happens again? And from a cognitive perspective, resentment represents this unfinished psychological business, which is the biggest part. It's unfinished. Research on perseverative cognition, which is just another way to say like rumination or worry, suggests that the brain stays activated. It's like alarm bells and cogs are still working when it believes a problem is still relevant to future safety or even social standing. Because there is a part of us that's still like caveman-esque and is concerned with the hierarchy of things and not being banished. So go figure. When there's no clear resolution to this problem that we're dealing with, the system stays on. It's kind of like trying to complete a rotation or a cycle. There is no completion. So we're just going to keep on trucking. And that's why resentment can feel just as alive months later or years later or a whole lot of time later because the nervous system doesn't recognize or doesn't reach that closure it needs. And there is that link between resentment and rumination, kind of like what I said. Rumination is that mental engine that keeps this resentment going. In research, we see that rumination is defined as repetitive, passive thinking about that distress and its causes, its consequences, anything kind of related to the topic we're ruminating on. The thing is, again, it doesn't move towards a resolution. I know this is a weird one, and I am a city girl, not a farm girl, but rumination kind of feels like It's a stupid one. I'm sorry. But a cow kind of chewing on the cud, chewing on that same piece over and over again. You could even think about if we're going to stay away from the cow. It's just you chewing on a piece of bubble gum. Even though it's lost its flavor, you keep on kind of chewing. And rumination fuels that because it involves a social threat like status, belonging, or again, fairness. And social threats are especially important to the brain. Again, any threat, but social ones, whew, it's like all high alerts everywhere. And because it's unresolved, this unresolved kind of harm, it keeps that threat system activated. So, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Being wronged by others always had consequences. And so the brain kind of evolved to remember, hey, this happens. We need to expect this to happen next. And because the brain doesn't want certain other things to happen, it wants to remember what has happened in order to prevent any social injuries. It doesn't want any bad things to happen. So it's going to remember. But the problem is that modern life often doesn't allow for this repair. There is sometimes not these series of consequences. We don't always get an apology. We don't always get acknowledgement. Sometimes we don't even have a chance to speak up for ourselves. And then there's no power to change that situation. It makes me think of like all of these like TikToks and different videos where it shows like modern day corporate world, which I work for myself, so I don't play into it or I don't really know how that feels. But I've seen a lot of videos where even in like Zoom meetings, bosses will be confronting like an employee. And then when the employee has something to come back to, they're like, oh, we're going to take this offline. So there is no justice in that situation if you just take it online or take it offline. But I do see a lot of videos where people are speaking up and not allowing that to stay that way. It's like, oh, you want to call me out in front of everybody? Why can't we finish this discussion here? And these kind of things do breed that resentment. And when you don't have that end, you're going to keep thinking about it. But not all repetitive thinking is bad. Yes, rumination has this bad thing, but when instead of ruminating, if we reflect, that's a better R word in this case. Reflection means that we have some flexible thinking. We are thinking of the situation in multiple different ways, which can lead to insight or action. And, it does require work, but at the end of it, we feel this clarity that we may not have had at the beginning of that thinking pattern. Whereas rumination is different because it's repetitive and rigid. It doesn't change the situation. It's replaying that same situation and same material over and over and over and over again, which increases that emotional distress and rarely leads to new information. Research consistently shows that rumination is linked to worse emotional outcomes, while purposeful reflection, on the other hand, and this meaning making are linked to recovery. The difference isn't how much you actually think, it's about what that thinking does. And if it creates movement and resolution, we're in a good place. But there are some people who do tend to ruminate more than others. There are several factors that increase your vulnerability to this not so great repetitive thinking, and which also leads to that whole resentment loop. If you have high emotional sensitivity, which means you're stronger emotionally encoding information into events, this can lead you to kind of replay a lot of that emotionality over and over again and really feel unfairness strongly. Another factor is early environments where emotions weren't validated. So you felt something so strongly and no one was there to back you up. So it kind of, again, is left without closure. If you are in a place where you have a low sense of agency or ability to express anger safely, that can lead to this rumination and resentment. before when I talked about like these corporate settings, a lot of these toxic workplaces do not allow you that agency, that ability to kind of be independent and stand up for yourself, which is why sometimes resentment builds in these toxic workplaces. You also might ruminate if you deal with perfectionism and self-blame because you want to be perfect. And when things aren't perfect, you tend to beat yourself up about them. We also see those who deal with chronic stress because your brain is in that survival mode. So you don't have the full prefrontal cortex to kind of figure your way out of it. And since we're talking about that, rumination is especially common in people who were taught not to express their anger, not to make waves, not to ask for repair. And so the mind does this instead. It expresses itself in this way instead. But let's take a break for a second because hearing all of this can be super overwhelming. And when you are feeling overwhelmed, worn out, or just not like yourself, I'm here to remind you that you're not broken, but you just might need some more resilience. Resilience isn't just about bouncing back. It's about staying grounded in hard moments, learning how to recover without shutting down, and building tools that can actually work in real life. And that's exactly what I teach inside my resilience workshop. It's a guided, practical program that walks you step by step through nervous system regulation, emotional awareness, and boundaries to protect that oh so precious energy. Without fluff, without toxic positivity. If you've ever said, I just need to get it together, this is your next step. Give me 6 weeks and we can work on strengthening your resilience. All you have to do is head to arizainspire.com resilience workshop or click the link in the show notes to learn more and join the workshop today. So now that we've talked about rumination and resentment, let's get into the brain science that kind of backs it up and makes it feel a little like icky and sticky and why we can't move on. Neuroscience research links rumination to increased activity in the default mode network, or the DMN. This network is involved in self-referential thinking. This is the thinking we do that kind of turns whatever is happening around us to ourselves. We kind of try to put ourselves in the situation. How is this affecting me? What do I think about this? What do I know about this? And that's the network that's involved in that. It's also involved in memory, mental time, and imagining alternative outcomes. So when resentment is present, the DMN replays the event. So that default mode network just replays the event, which means that emotional networks reactivate that feeling. And that threat system, that threat and in the moment system keeps it replaying and keeps it relevant. So it's creating a loop. Remember, react, interpret, remember again. And we just keep going. This is not the brain trying to punish you, though. It's trying to learn from that harm that happened. That emotion has hit it so hard that it's trying to remember what happened and make sense of it in order to not happen again. But without that ending, without that closure and resolution, learning just turns into looping instead, because we don't have an outcome that will help us learn from the experience. It doesn't have a consequence, so we don't know, which means we can't finish the loop. Which is why when people say forgive and forget, it doesn't really work. Telling yourself to just forgive can actually intensify resentment. Why, you ask? Because forgiveness is often treated as an emotional bypass. It's like, just forgive them, which means there's no boundary, there's no acknowledgement, there's no grief, there's no meaning making. You're just kind of trying to make a bridge over it and be done with it. But that doesn't help. And research on thought suppression, because This emotional bypass is kind of almost similar to thought suppression, shows that pushing emotions away often make them rebound stronger, especially when injustice is involved. So, this brings us into emotional suppression. What is that thing, emotional suppression? Because this is a big one. And I've touched on it a little bit, but let's get into it deeper this session because emotional suppression is this act of pushing away, hiding, inhibiting, not expressing an emotion that we are feeling, meaning something that has already been activated in our system. And a lot of times, clients don't want to feel the feelings. This is common. It's fine. We have to feel the feelings, but we don't want to. And this can look like, hey, don't feel this. I think of like Frozen, don't feel, conceal. Girl had to let it go, but, stop crying, push it down. People like throw it in the closet, forget about it. I need to calm down, keep a neutral face, all of these things, right? But there's a distinction. Suppression is not regulation. Suppression happens late in the emotion process when the body is already activated. So suppression is not going to do anything about this. So what does suppression actually do to our body? Suppression, and the first mechanism is it increases physiological arousal, meaning your body is totally just going to keep reacting. One of the most consistent findings in emotion research is this. When people suppress emotions, their bodies stay highly activated, even if they look calm on the outside. Study by James Gross and colleagues found that emotional suppression does not reliably reduce those emotional experiences. That sympathetic nervous system is still activated. Your heart is still racing. Your blood pressure is still increasing. And your stress hormones are just out of whack. So even if you stop yourself from crying or expressing anger or try to pull an Elsa and conceal, don't feel, your body is still going to react. Your emotion is still on, and the energy has nowhere to go. It's just there. And that trapped activation often shows up later as strong emotional rebounds, irritability, anxiety, exhaustion, or the emotion just kind of comes out of nowhere and floods. So the bottom line is suppression silences expression, but not the emotion itself. The emotion's going to feel itself. So the second mechanism we need to look at is that the brain interprets suppression as a threat. Shocker. So you trying not to feel the feeling actually makes your body feel on higher alert. So from a nervous system perspective, suppression sends a confusing signal. Something is happening inside me, but it's not allowed. And the brain is very sensitive to this internal conflict. So when you try to suppress that emotion, the amygdala remains active. That emotional center, that threat center, boom, still active. That prefrontal cortex is working harder to try to get there to inhibit that expression. And that increased cognitive load just stresses you out. The nervous system often reads this as the emotion must be dangerous if I have to stop it. And that interpretation actually amplifies that threat signal, making the emotion feel more urgent and more intense, which leads us to the third mechanism, the rebound effect. Psychologist Daniel Wagner describes something called ironic process theory, or this rebound theory. And here's how it works. One part of your mind tries to suppress the thought or feeling, and another part of your mind has to monitor whether it's coming back. That monitoring keeps the emotion mentally active. So here's a classic example. Don't think about that pink elephant in the corner of the room, right? So you immediately think about it. And then you're highly aware that it's there and trying not to be aware that it's there at the same time. So this works with emotions the same way. Suppression requires that constant checking. Am I still feeling this? Do I still notice that? And that checking keeps the emotion accessible. And when your control weakens, because there's only so much energy we can put towards this at a time, whether we're not sleeping because we're trying to suppress it, whether we're just feeling tired in general or stressed out in general, that emotion is going to come out of nowhere and bite you in the butt. That pink elephant in the corner of the room is going to run you over, which is why suppressed feelings often come back later, come up unexpectedly, and feel even more out of proportion than they did when they first hit you. They weren't ever gone. They were just being held down. It's almost like a spring back effect. When you hold down a spring, so much energy, as soon as you let it go, it kind of attacks you. That's what we're doing here. Now, the fourth mechanism is that suppression blocks emotional processing. So emotions have a natural beginning, a natural middle, and even an end when they're being processed. And when we suppress them, we stop that process. Processing usually involves recognizing that emotion, allowing the bodily sensations, making meaning of that emotion, responding to that emotion appropriately, and then, of course, coming back to baseline. When we suppress the emotion doesn't complete its action tendency. We don't have meaning, so meaning isn't integrated into anything. The nervous system doesn't get that resolved signal, so the brain keeps the emotion on standby. There is no return to baseline at the end of this. And this is especially true for emotions that are tied to injustice, like anger and resentment, loss, like grief, shame, and fear. Unprocessed emotions remain biologically relevant until they reach that resolution, which comes to mechanism 5, the idea that suppression increases cognitive and emotional load. Suppressing emotion requires so much ongoing effort. I don't think we ever realize that, how much work it is to actually hold back all of those emotions. And because of this effort, we are drained, which means our working memory, the part of our brain that's trying to process everything that is happening at that moment, doesn't have that energy to do that. It reduces cognitive flexibility, meaning we don't necessarily have the ability to think differently or change our minds or really work a problem. So that means that our problem solving ability is impaired. And of course, we're going to feel tired. Over time, this can lead to emotional burnout, numbness, which is usually followed by flooding because, again, that whole spring back thing. It could also lead to dissociation, irritability, and reduced tolerance for stress. Because as the system becomes overloaded, the emotion itself just kind of takes over. But because the effort requires to contain it, everything's just all out of whack. Which leads us to mechanism 6, that suppression disrupts regulation. A lot of social regulation too, because humans regulate emotions relationally, whether we want to or not. Because I know there's Miss Independent out there who's like, I don't need anybody, but you do. So when emotions are expressed appropriately, others can respond appropriately as well. We can have validation. We can have that repair. And, safety cues are received by the opposite person. But suppression removes all access to this feedback loop, which means that the person you're talking to doesn't know how to respond, doesn't know how to validate what's going on, and doesn't necessarily feel safe. Which means that in research, we see that chronic suppression is associated with lower relationship satisfaction, reduced social support, increased loneliness, and increased depressive symptoms. And I see this when we talk about sharing the emotional weight with our friends. I don't want my friend to have to deal with this because they're dealing with a lot of stuff of their own. But that's what friendship's for. That is what relationship is for. Because without relational regulation, the nervous system has to manage alone, which increases emotional intensity. And then we might as well be alone. But why suppression feels like it should work? That's the big question, right? Because we think like, hey, this is too intense. Let me not feel it. Suppression often feels helpful in the moment because it creates this idea of control. And we all love to feel in control, but it's only short-term control. And it avoids vulnerability, which is important. And it reduces visible disruption. But short-term control does not equal long-term regulation. And suppression trades immediate containment for delayed amplification, which at the end of the day, nobody has time to deal with something 10 times bigger later on. Let's deal with it now. We see that this withholding of all this emotion can lead to more chronic emotional unwellness. And we can see this even with chronic resentment, because resentment can become more chronic when emotions are unsafe to express. And when you've learned that these emotions are unsafe to express, you feel resentful and upset, and that emotional energy has nowhere to go. Resentment is more likely to become chronic when boundaries were discouraged, when there's a power imbalance present, whether it's something in your workplace, your family, your relationships, something you dealt with growing up, that power imbalance just builds more resentment. We see more resentment when emotional needs were constantly minimized or are constantly minimized. We see self-blame replaced with outward expression. And a lot of times in these cases, resentment isn't about one event. It's about patterns of unmet needs. Like when we talk about relationships, a lot of time it's not one thing that causes a relationship to crumble. It's a culmination of all these little things that bred this resentment. But now it's time for my favorite part of the episode: practical tools to help with this. So, what can actually help with resentment? The first and most important part is to name the specific injustice. I know it's tough, but resentment softens when it becomes precise. And if we have, this is what, episode 5 so far of season 3, if there's anything we've learned is that precision in our language and precision in understanding what's going on with us brings a sense of comfort and regulation. So instead of just saying, I'm just bitter, try, I was dismissed. I wasn't protected. I was expected to tolerate something that crossed my values. I wasn't given a voice. Or this situation is not fair. This specific language helps the brain organize meaning instead of just replaying this emotional loop. The next thing that we can do is identify what was taken or denied. So complete this sentence. I'm resentful because I needed blank and I didn't get it. There are a lot of common answers. So it could be that you didn't get respect, you didn't get safety, you didn't get honesty, reciprocity, appreciation. You didn't get repaired to the situation or feel that you had a voice or you could do something in the situation, like have any agency. This step moves resentment from being vague anger to a clear, unmet need, which then leads us to 3, is where we ask the critical question: repair or grief? Because when it comes to resentment, resentment needs one of those two things. Either I'm going to repair or I'm going to grieve. Repair just means we are going to repair a boundary, repair conversational patterns and skills. We're going to repair accountability, or there's going to be some changed behavior. But if there is no repair. That means we have to grieve. We have to have a sadness at this loss of something at this point. It could be this acceptance that repair won't happen. So the loss of that chance to repair a relationship. We can be grieving what we had hoped for, mourning that loss of a future or a choice or something that didn't get to be. We let go of this fantasy that it would be made right. And we grieve the fact that this was unfair and there is no justice, which again doesn't feel good. But we see that rumination decreases dramatically once the brain knows which path it's on. Once it has that clarity on repair or grieve, your brain can settle. Which leads us to 4, to express that anger safely, even if not to that person. And no, this does not mean get violent. We don't need to be violent, but anger just needs some type of movement, some type of action. Here are some options that don't necessarily require violence, so please don't do that. Write what you would say to that person. You don't have to send it. I know it seems kind of corny, but just having the words out, even like there is this technique we use in therapy called like an empty chair, where we talk to the imaginary person and have that conversation to let it out. We can, like I said, speak it out loud or in private. Sometimes I even suggest, like, if you're not a writer, record a voice note on your phone so that you can just get that energy and those words out. We can also use physical movement like walking or intense exercise. And if you need some type of like, quote unquote, semi-violent behavior, you can like punch a punching bag or beat up your pillow, I guess. I always err away from that kind of violence behavior because there are some studies that show aggression just breeds more aggression. Not all studies, but there are some. But we want to, at the end of the day, get that release, that somatic kind of release, right? So we can do that by shaking, by stretching, even by crying. At the end of the day, these actions help complete that action tendency that we have for anger. Number 5 is to set an internal boundary. If external boundaries weren't possible, we need to make sure we're setting those internal ones. So try, I don't owe ongoing emotional access to someone who has crossed my boundaries. This reduces that re-exposure, which keeps resentment alive. This just means that we do not have to allow access to ourselves if someone cannot treat us the way that we deserve. Because when we keep putting ourselves in situations that don't serve us, that's when we let this resentment come into our lives as well. Number 6, we're going to interrupt rumination with compassion, not suppression. So instead of saying to stop thinking about the situation, we're going to try, I'm thinking about this because it mattered. I'm thinking about this because this happened to me. I'm thinking about this because this hurt. But this is the crucial part. I'm choosing to come back to the present. We redirect that thought process. We redirect that feeling and ground ourselves. We give movement. We do a value-based action. Or we take the time to not just ruminate on the feeling, we reflect and we start to question and try to think of this situation differently. Because these things align with evidence-based approaches to repetitive thoughts. Number 7, when resentment is a long-standing pattern, though, we have to get support. And this is a big one. So if we're doing all these things and we still feel that resentment is something bigger than we can handle on our own, we need to get that support. Because chronic resentment often signals something bigger. It could be trauma. It could be unresolved grief. It could be suppressed anger. It could be relational injury. And there are a lot of different therapy approaches that often help. There's emotion-focused therapy. We have trauma-informed cognitive therapy, somatic approaches, value-based work. These could be other ways to kind of soften or help you work through the resentment. And having someone to talk to as you go through this process is super helpful in being able to work on solving that emotional loop. So, if resentment keeps showing up, it doesn't mean you're stuck in the past. It means something in you is still asking this big, important question: did what happened to me matter? And the answer, of course, is yes. The goal isn't to erase resentment. The goal is to understand what it's protecting, complete what was interrupted, and give your nervous system permission to stand down. So this week, try this. When resentment surfaces, I want you to ask, is this asking for repair or is this asking for grief? Because once that question is answered, your mind doesn't have to keep repeating it, and you can finish that emotional cycle that your body is begging to finish. But that's it for today's episode, my friends. I hope you found it informative. I've seen that with all this information I've been gathering for this season, it's been really helpful even with my clients during sessions. So I'm hoping you feel that this is helping you along the way too. And if you found this helpful, share it with someone. Give us a review. Let us know what's going on. And if you want some more tools and want some more support on this mental wellness journey, head over to arizainspire.com. You'll find extra resources, you'll find courses, you'll find workshops and workbooks, all these different tools to help you on this journey and show up for yourself. And don't forget to follow along on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Ariza Inspire Co. because that's where we keep this conversation going. I share a lot of mental health tips. Right now, I'm talking about seasonal affective disorder and the difference between those and how you can help yourself, because God knows we need some help during this season, not only with the season, but other contextual things going on. And of course, I keep you up to date on what to expect with new episodes as well as new things that I'm dropping. But at the end of the day, my friend, I want you to take care of yourself. Be good to yourself. Show yourself some extra compassion today. And I'll catch you next time. Can't wait for next week? Here's a sneak peek of the next episode on the Ariza Inspire podcast. It's going to do that to help you survive that day. But the problem isn't just about that day. If it was just about that day, we could go back to that whole homeostasis kind of model. But because you're in such a high demand position and because you are in this 24/7 need to go, be ready to, on your toes type stuff, your body does something a little different. That stress is repeated day after day. So the body isn't allowed to go back to baseline. It needs to keep performing. So what does it do? It adjusts that baseline. And that's what allostasis is. The body has come to this decision that the level of demand is the new normal. So if this is the new normal, I have to stay prepared.